Somewhere in a freezer in Edinburgh, there are vials of blood drawn from people whose grandparents never left the same parish. Somewhere else, in the soil of two quiet cemeteries in eastern Scotland, there are skeletons that have been waiting more than 1,000 years to answer a question historians have argued about for generations. And when scientists finally cracked open both of those archives and compared them, the story most people believe about the Scottish. Highlands, one ancient warrior people, one unbroken bloodline stretching back into the mist, didn't survive contact with the data. What actually showed up in the genome was stranger, more fractured, and in some ways far more remarkable than the legend ever was. This isn't speculation from an amateur genealogy forum. The two studies at the center of this story were published in two of the most rigorously reviewed venues in science. The first, The Genetic Landscape of Scotland and the Isles, appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2019, led by Professor James Wilson of the University of Edinburgh, alongside Edmund Gilbert and Gianpiero Cavalieri of the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. It analyzed genetic data from 2,544 people across Scotland, England, Wales, and Ireland, cross-referencing it against ancient DNA to map, for the first time, the fine-grained genetic structure of the entire Scottish population. The second study, published in PLOS Genetics, involved researchers Linus Girdland Flink and Kate Britton of the University of Aberdeen, and Adeline Moores-Jacobs of Liverpool John Moores University, who sequenced whole genomes recovered directly from Pictish-era skeletons excavated at two early medieval cemeteries. Two entirely separate research teams, two entirely different methods, one working from living volunteers, one working from a 1,000-year-old graveyard, and both of them converging on a picture of Scottish ancestry that overturns almost everything the popular version of Highland history assumed. Before we get into what they actually found, it helps to understand what the old story even was, and the easiest way to explain it is with a simple analogy. Imagine you're told your family has lived in the same town for 1,000 years, all descended from one legendary founder, the bloodline passed down clean and unbroken like a single thread running straight through history. That's roughly the popular image of the Highland clans. Proud, ancient, genetically distinct tribes tracing back to a single Celtic stock, sealed off in their glens since time immemorial. Now, imagine instead that when you finally test the DNA, you discover the town wasn't founded by one family thread at all, but was more like a river delta. Several different streams of people merging, splitting, and remixing over centuries, sometimes isolated from each other for a generation or two, sometimes flooding together during a war or a migration, leaving a pattern in the silt that's genuinely traceable, but nothing like a single clean bloodline. That river delta pattern is much closer to what the genome actually shows. Here's the number that anchors the whole story. In the 2019 Edinburgh-led study, researchers found that Shetlanders carry roughly 18% Norwegian ancestry, while people in the Hebrides carry around 7%, and mainland Scots in the Highlands and in Argyll carry closer to 4%. 18% versus 4%, a fourfold difference in a country most outsiders would lump together as simply Scottish. That gap alone, measured across a landmass smaller than the state of Maine, tells you the Highlands were never one single genetic population. To understand how the researchers even arrived at numbers that precise, it helps to know a little about the method itself, because it's not simply a matter of reading off a percentage from a spit tube the way a commercial ancestry kit does. Wilson's team used a statistical technique called fine structure, which works by comparing tiny shared chunks of DNA, called haplotypes, between thousands of living people and reference populations from Norway, England, and Wales. The more identical chunks two people share and the longer those shared chunks are, the more recently their ancestors were connected, like comparing two copies of the same book that have each been through a few generations of careless photocopying and counting exactly how many identical smudges and creases they still share. Applied across the entire Scottish population, this method was sensitive enough to detect genetic boundaries as narrow as 3 kilometers apart in the Northern Isles, a level of geographic precision that had never been achieved for this region before. That precision is what allowed the team to separate out signals as fine-grained as the difference between someone from Orkney and someone from Shetland, two archipelagos separated by little more than open water and a shared Norse heritage. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the study didn't stop at percentages. It found that Scotland's genetic boundaries still line up remarkably closely with the political boundaries of Dark Age kingdoms that stopped existing over 1,000 years ago. The territories of the Gaels, the Picts, the Britons, and the Norse. The Highland line itself, the geographic and cultural boundary that has separated Gaelic, speaking Highlanders from Scots, speaking Lowlanders for centuries, turned out to be a genuine genetic boundary too, not just a cultural or linguistic one. People in the Hebrides, the Highlands, Argyll, and even Donegal across the water in Ireland showed clear signs of long-term genetic isolation. Small, tightly bounded communities that had been marrying locally for generation after generation, exactly as you'd expect in remote glens and island chains where travel was hard and outsiders were rare. Let's pause and restack that, because it's a genuinely significant finding. A kingdom that hasn't existed since roughly the 9th century still leaves a measurable signature in the DNA of people living in that same region today. That's not folklore. That's population genetics. Confirming, with hard data, something historians had only ever been able to argue from old chronicles and place names. But the second study is where the popular story really starts to come apart, because it goes after the Picts specifically, the group at the very heart of the romanticized ancient Highland warrior myth. For centuries, the Picts have been treated as almost mythical, a mysterious tribe of tattooed warriors who supposedly appeared from nowhere, spoke an untraceable language, and vanished just as abruptly after merging with the Gaels to form the Kingdom of Alba. Some medieval and later writers even floated the idea that the Picts had migrated in from somewhere entirely foreign. Some early accounts placed their origins as far away as Scythia, near the Black Sea. When the Aberdeen and Liverpool John Moore's research team actually sequenced whole genomes from skeletons excavated at the London Links and Ballantory cemeteries, dating to the Pictish period between roughly 300 and 900 CE, the foreign origin story simply didn't hold up. The genomes showed strong genetic continuity with the Iron Age people who were already living in Britain long before the Picts appear in the historical record. In other words, the Picts weren't invaders from some exotic, distant homeland. They were, genetically, local, descendants of people who had already been on that land for centuries, not a mysterious tribe that swept in from the fringes of the known world. Here's the part that connects everything else in this story. There's a second myth the same Pictish study went after, and it's one that even serious historians had repeated for generations. An early medieval writer named Bede claimed that when the Picts first landed in Ireland before settling in Britain, they were only allowed to marry local women on the condition that their royal succession would pass down through the female line, rather than the male line, a practice called matrilineal succession, where a king's power passes to his sister's son rather than his own. That detail got repeated in history books for over 1,000 years as a defining, exotic feature of Pictish society. The research team's genetic evidence, combined with a fresh look at the historical record, pointed instead to a more mundane explanation. Scholars now believe the matrilineal succession story was likely fabricated later, used as a political tool to help validate the legitimacy of specific Pictish rulers, whose claim to the throne needed extra justification. The tattooed, mysterious, matrilineal Pictish warrior of popular imagination turns out, on closer inspection, to be mostly just local. Farmers and rulers who told useful stories about themselves. Normal people who inherited normal political problems and solved them the way political dynasties usually do, through convenient rewrites of their own history. And it's worth being direct about one more myth these findings quietly demolish, because it's still repeated online more often than you'd expect. The idea, sometimes called British Israelism, that the Scots and other British peoples descend from one of the biblical lost tribes of Israel. There is no genetic evidence supporting that claim in any of this data, and it isn't a fringe technicality. Every serious population genetics study of the British Isles, including the ones at the center of this video, shows ancestry rooted firmly in the successive European populations that actually settled the islands. The Picts, the Gaels, the Britons, the Anglo-Saxons, the Norse, and later arrivals from France and the Low Countries. Nothing more exotic than that, and honestly, nothing that needs to be more exotic than that, because the real story turns out to be strange enough on its own. It's also worth understanding briefly how the Aberdeen and Liverpool John Moore's team actually managed to pull usable genetic data out of skeletons that old in the first place, because ancient DNA doesn't survive the way people often assume. Bone and tooth samples from the London Links and Ballantory cemeteries had to be processed in dedicated ancient DNA laboratories, built specifically to prevent modern human DNA from contaminating fragile, degraded ancient samples, DNA that, after more than 1,000 years in the ground, typically survives only in short, damaged fragments rather than clean, complete strands. The team sequenced complete mitochondrial genomes, the DNA passed down exclusively through the maternal line from 7 individuals at London Links alone, then compared those results against both other Iron Age British genomes and present-day populations across the UK using the same haplotype-based methods pioneered in the living population study. That cross-checking between 2 entirely different eras of evidence, ancient bone and modern blood, is exactly what allowed both research teams to arrive at conclusions neither one could have reached working alone. Now here's where the 2 studies really start reinforcing each other rather than just running in parallel. The 2019 Living Population Study had already identified something researchers called a Highland cluster, distinguished in part by a high concentration of a Y chromosome lineage known as R1b-L21, along with genetic signatures connected to Ireland. A reminder that the Gaelic-speaking Highlands share deep, ongoing roots with Ireland's own Gaelic populations, not a separate origin story invented independently in Scotland. Separately, that same research identified a distinct northeast cluster, roughly covering Aberdeenshire and Moray, an area that maps almost exactly onto historical Pictish territory in eastern Scotland. Put those two findings next to the Pictish genome study, and you get a genuinely striking convergence. Two completely different research teams using two completely different kinds of evidence, one from living blood samples, one from a 1,000-year-old graveyard, independently pointing at the same eastern Scottish region as genetically distinct, and both linking that distinctiveness back to the same vanished Pictish kingdom. What makes this so significant isn't just that the ancient kingdoms turn out to be real in some genealogical sense, it's what it reveals about how identity actually gets built. The popular idea of a single, ancient, unbroken Highland bloodline was never really a scientific claim in the first place. It was a story that got constructed much later, and we actually know almost exactly when. In August 1822, King George IV made the first visit by a reigning British monarch to Scotland in roughly 140 years, and the entire event was stage managed by the novelist Sir Walter Scott, who by then had already spent years romanticizing Highland culture in his fiction. Scott dressed the king himself in Highland attire, commissioned a small fortune in tartan cloth, and encouraged the idea that specific clans had always worn specific, unique tartan patterns, even though weavers of the period actually chose colors based on locally available dyes, and the notion of one fixed set belonging to one family name was, by most historians' accounts, closer to an invention than a revival. Suddenly, lowland aristocrats who had spent generations distancing themselves from Highland culture were scrambling to prove they had even a drop of Highland ancestry, and a fashion born out of royal pageantry and Scott's own literary imagination hardened, within a generation, into what felt like ancient, unbroken tradition. The real genetic story underneath that romantic surface is less like a single bloodline and more like a set of long isolated regional populations, each shaped by its own local history of who married whom, who arrived by longship, and who never left the glen at all. A history that existed for centuries before Walter Scott ever picked up a pen, and that owes nothing to the tartan he helped popularize. In the next part of this, it's worth being honest about exactly what these genetic findings can and can't tell you, because this is precisely where a lot of popular science coverage overreaches, and where the story needs to slow down and get careful. What both studies prove at the population level is real and well established. Distinct, statistically robust regional genetic clusters exist across Scotland. They correlate strongly with historical Dark Age kingdom boundaries, and ancient Pictish genomes show clear continuity with pre-existing Iron Age populations rather than a foreign migration. Nobody serious is disputing that part. But population-level clustering is not the same thing as individual-level proof. And this distinction matters enormously if you're the kind of person who's ever taken a commercial DNA test and been told you're Highland Scottish, or shown a specific clan crest based on your results. A cluster describes a statistical tendency shared by thousands of people across a region over centuries. It cannot tell any single person that they are a direct, unbroken descendant of a specific named clan chief, or prove membership in one particular historical bloodline, rather than any of the dozens of others who lived and intermarried in that same valley. Y chromosome results like R1b-L21 can indicate that your paternal line likely originated in a Highland or Irish Gaelic population going back many centuries, but they cannot single-handedly confirm which specific historical group, chief, or clan story you personally belong to, and anyone selling you that level of specificity is overstating what the science can actually deliver. Likewise, the matrilineal succession finding about the Picts is a matter of historical and textual scholarship, reasoning about likely political motive, not something the genome itself can directly confirm or refute. It's an inference built on top of the genetic evidence, not a DNA readout of ancient royal customs. Being careful about that line between what a population study can robustly establish and what an individual family tree can actually claim is exactly the kind of caution real geneticists build into their own published conclusions, even when the headlines built on top of their work don't always carry the same caveats forward. There's also a real limit to how far back this kind of ancient DNA sampling currently reaches. The Pictish genomes came from exactly 2 cemeteries, and while the results are consistent with what's known from other archaeological sites, 2 burial grounds cannot single-handedly represent the full genetic diversity of a kingdom that spanned hundreds of years, and a large stretch of eastern and northern Scotland. Future excavations and further sequencing will very likely refine and possibly complicate the picture these 2 studies have started to sketch out. That's not a weakness unique to this research. It's simply how population genetics and archaeology actually make progress, one careful, well-documented burial site and one well-sampled cohort at a time, rather than one sweeping final answer delivered all at once. It's worth adding one more layer of caution here, because it cuts against the grain of how this kind of story usually gets told. Nobody involved in either study is claiming that genetics alone can settle questions of identity, belonging, or who legitimately counts as a Highlander today. Those are cultural and personal questions, not ones a lab result is equipped to answer. What the data can responsibly tell you is where large groups of ancestors likely lived and who they likely married, generation after generation, across a specific stretch of centuries. It cannot tell you who deserves a tartan, who has the real claim to a clan name, or which family's oral history is more authentic than another's. Treating a genetic cluster as a certificate of authenticity would be exactly the kind of overreach these researchers themselves have been careful to avoid in their own published conclusions. So what does survive, once you strip away the romanticized version and keep only what the evidence actually supports? Something arguably better than the myth. Not a single mystical, unbroken warrior bloodline stretching back into legend, but a genuinely traceable, scientifically documented pattern of real communities. Gaels in the west, Picts in the north and east, Britons in the southwest, Norse settlers pressing down from Shetland and Orkney, who lived isolated and distinct in their own corners of a rugged landscape for centuries, leaving a signature in the DNA of their descendants that two completely independent scientific teams, using two completely different kinds of evidence, both managed to detect and confirm. Which brings us back to those vials in an Edinburgh freezer and those two burial grounds in the Scottish soil, both of them holding the same quiet, patient answer the whole time. Not to a question about tartans or clan crests or which sept a surname belongs to, but to a much older and much more interesting question about who actually lived on that land, who they married, and how thoroughly the past manages to survive encoded inside people who never even knew it was there. The Highlands were never one bloodline. They were several, Pictish, Gaelic, Norse, and Briton, all still quietly writing themselves into the DNA of the people walking those glens today. So tell me in the comments, which surprised you more? Finding out the mysterious, supposedly foreign Picts were actually local the whole time, or finding out that a kingdom which vanished over 1,000 years ago is still detectable in Scottish DNA today?